Good evening. Welcome to the March 28th, 2022 special meeting of the Stillwater City Council. This time I will call the meeting to order and we will jump right into the agenda on item 2, general orders. Item A, which is presentation of the proposed fiscal year 2023 operating budget by Ms. Christy Clark.
Okay, good evening, Christy Clark, Finance Director. And as you said, we're here to review the fiscal year 23 proposed budget. Shelby Johns, our budget specialist, and I will be tag teaming throughout the presentation to provide that overview and then also to discuss some challenges that we're facing related to budget. So as a reminder, preparation and adoption of the annual budget is required by state statute. The proposed budget is balanced. However, the assumptions used to balance the budget are going to require action of the council in the current fiscal year. And I will go through that in much more detail towards the end of the presentation. Okay, so the City Council has adopted a strategic plan, and on this slide is a list of the strategic priorities included in the current plan. So this strategic plan provides a framework for city management, for the finance department, and for city staff as we follow, as we prepare the budget that's before you tonight. Our budget cycle is a year-long process. And so right now we're in phase 1, or just completing phase 1, which is the budget preparation phase, and transitioning into phase 2, which is the council approval phase. The timeline that we've identified to complete the budget adoption includes holding a public hearing on April 18th, and then presenting budget resolutions to the council for approval on May 16th. At any time during the remainder of the adoption process that changes are needed, finance will include or incorporate those changes into the budget. And I will now turn the presentation over to Shelby, and she will provide an overview of the fiscal year 23 proposed budget.
Hello, everyone. Sorry, I'm short. So my name is Shelby Johns, and I'm the budget specialist. Tonight, I'm going to walk you through the fiscal year 23 proposed budget. This is going to be a high-level presentation of the budget by major fund, fund type, and category with the transfers and direct/indirect costs excluded. Details by fund and department are included as part of the agenda packet. First, we're looking at revenues. The fiscal year 23 total proposed revenue budget is $135.9 million. Overall, this is an increase compared to the fiscal year 22 adopted budget by a total of $18.4 million. We have seen an upward trend in tax collections, and with the transportation sales tax and the visitor tax initiatives being passed, we are projecting an increase in tax revenue. For example, there is an $8 million increase in sales tax, which is included in the general fund, and an $800,000 increase in visitor tax, which is in other governmental funds. Next, we're looking at the same revenue numbers, but by source instead of by fund. Electric revenue, which is shown in white, encompasses 43% of the total revenue budget. Sales and use tax, which is shown in blue, is 29%. Water, which is shown in gray, is 10%. Other revenues is shown in this greenish gray color, whatever you want to call it, and that's 8%. So this includes other taxes, fees for services, licenses and permits, and other miscellaneous revenue. Wastewater revenue, which is shown in yellow, encompasses 5% of the total revenue, and waste management, which is shown in orange, is also 5%. Please note that the water and wastewater revenues fund their operations and do not contribute to the operation of the general fund. Next, we'll look at the expenditures by fund type. The fiscal year 23 total proposed expenditure budget is $122.1 million. Overall, this is an increase compared to last fiscal year by $9.6 million. Some key differences include the fire and police payroll increase that totals nearly $1 million. Electric was also another department that received a raise, and that rose their payroll by $570,000. Due to the rise in inflation, expenditures in the general fund increased by approximately $290,000 and $310,000 in the SUA operating fund. Similar to revenues, we have the same expenditure numbers, but by category. Personnel, which is shown in white, encompasses 43% of our total expenditure budget. Purchase power, which is shown in blue, is 23%. Other services and fees, which is shown in gray, are 18%. Debt service, which is shown in this greenish gray color, is 8%. And materials and supplies are shown in yellow, which is 6%. And then capital outlay, which has decreased, is shown in orange, and it's at 2%. So as you can see, the capital outlay has decreased. We have several projects that are currently in the works or currently out for bid, and we've noticed that those projects or those bids have been coming in a lot higher than what we previously budgeted for. So as you can see, there's a balance in the capital fund, and those funds may be needed to cover those additional costs. But departments did submit their fiscal year 23 capital requests, and the CIP, or Capital Improvement Plan team, made their recommendations. So as we complete our current projects and get more comfortable with our balance in the capital fund, we will complete those fiscal year 23 requests based on those priority levels. So now let's review the balances in our reserve funds. As a reminder, reserves are intended to meet unexpected needs and to minimize disruption caused by an unexpected emergency that may lead to significant decreases in revenue or increases in expenditures. So the reserve funds serve as our last line of defense in a disaster, which is why these funds are not used to meet operating needs. The general fund is fully funded at $11 million, and the self-insurance fund is fully funded at $1 million. Since council approved a $6 million loan for the TIF number 4 project, or tax increment financing, the electric, water, and wastewater revenue or reserves are not fully funded. The waste management reserve currently sits at over $500,000, so we're moving in the right direction to get that fully funded. And then the airport reserve, which is fairly new, has not met their target, but currently sits at $250,000. So I'll send it back to Christy so she can discuss the increases in revenue and expenditures and how those increases impact our overall operating budget. Thanks.
So I felt it was important to spend some time focusing on the budget for the general fund and the SUA operating fund. So these two funds comprise the majority of all of our city operations, and they also represent what we refer to as our undesignated or unrestricted funds. These two funds are also dependent upon each other because significant annual transfers occur between the two funds. So I'm first going to start with a look at the general fund, and this is where all general city services are paid from. So that's going to be the police department, fire department, community development, the library, and finance, city manager's office, and IT, just to name a few. The primary funding source for the general fund is sales and use tax, and then also a transfer from the SUA. And I'll go through transfers in quite a bit of detail a little bit later. So each month our marketing department releases the updated sales and use tax numbers, and we have been very blessed, and for the last 14 months we have seen that our sales tax collections each month have been up over the prior year's collections. And furthermore, and as I stated during the fiscal year 22 second quarter financial report, we are currently experiencing historic collection levels. So one of the questions that we get, and it's been asked many times and in many ways, is if our revenues are up, then why is our budget still so tight? And so that's what I'm going to talk about and hopefully try to help answer. This slide shows the increases in fiscal year 23 proposed revenues over the fiscal year 22 adopted budget. The numbers on this slides that I'm going to show you aren't necessarily going to match the numbers that Shelby had just gone through, and that's because the numbers that Shelby showed you were gross budget numbers and excluded transfers, and I'm going to be netting some numbers and then including transfers where it's appropriate to do so. So we're projecting an increase of $8 million in sales tax collections in the fiscal year 23 proposed budget. So this includes both the increase due to the voters passing the half-cent transportation tax in February, as well as an increase related to just the overall increase in collection trends.
Is that an increase over the fiscal year 22 budget or actual collections in fiscal year 22?
Fiscal year 22 adopted budget.
Okay.
Yeah. So we're also projecting an increase of $600,000 in use tax, $75,000 in alcohol tax, and $80,000 in police fines for a total general fund revenue increase of $8,755,000. And so this slide shows the increases in general fund expenditures, and again, over the fiscal year 22 adopted budget. Because we're projecting an increase in sales tax, we must also budget for an increase in transfers out of the dedicated portion of the sales tax. So of the $8 million increase in sales tax revenue that we saw on the prior slide, we must transfer $1 million to the SUA because 1 cent of our sales tax is dedicated to the SUA. And we must transfer $5 million to the Transportation Sales Tax Fund because now we have a full penny that's dedicated to transportation projects. Then on that third line, the council entered into an agreement with American Airlines for a minimum revenue guarantee, so that net increase in expenditures is $1 million. Fire payroll has increased about $515,000, police payroll about $475,000, and other general fund payroll has increased about $395,000. And that increase in general fund, the other general fund payroll, that's related to the reauthorization of some positions that have been on hold since COVID began, as well as the reorganization that occurred in city engineering that added some positions. And then we've added some new software and services that total about $325,000. And then we provided a modest, I'll say very modest, inflationary adjustment to our departments as they submitted their operating budget requests. So the total increase to expenditures is $9 million. So when we net the revenue increase against the expenditure increase, we see that the net revenue increase is actually a negative $245,000. So to fund these types of deficits, the general fund relies on a transfer from the SUA. And that transfer has averaged just under $16 million each year over the last 7 years. Staff was able to cover this deficit through the transfer and preparation of the budget that you've seen tonight. However, the ability to rely on the SUA to cover these types of deficits is just becoming more and more difficult. And so why is that? Well, one of the reasons is that we're experiencing the same negative net revenue growth in the SUA operating fund that we're seeing in the general fund. And I will go through that calculation on the next couple of slides here in a minute. But one reason for that negative net revenue growth is that we discontinued the automatic utility rate escalators back in January of 2019. And that was intended to simply offset inflation. So inflation increased 5.1% in calendar year 2021 alone. And if we go back to the point at which we suspended the rate escalator, we can see that inflation has increased 15.7%. And that 15.7% is inflation in total. So if we drill into that and we look at some industry-specific increases that would have more of an impact directly on the city, we see that utilities has increased by about 13.4%. Energy has increased by about 28.1%. And then motor fuel has increased by 43.7%. So all of those percentages I just gave you, those are from the Bureau of Labor Statistics for the South Urban region. So that second bullet point, we've also relied on unrestricted and undesignated fund balance to meet budget balancing needs in prior years. And then finally, we recently elected to use fund balance to offset $3.6 million in Storm Uri costs rather than passing those on to our customers.
Could you make sure, did you say since the rate escalation had been discontinued, the increase in inflation was 15.6%?
15.7%.
15.7%,
Yes.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so the next few slides are going to illustrate that negative net revenue growth in the SUA operating fund. And just to clarify, the SUA operating fund is essentially the electric utility. So we're projecting electric sales to increase by about $3 million, and energy payments from the Grand River Dam Authority to increase about $1.2 million. The energy payments are the sale of energy that we generate when we operate our power plant. And then lastly, we have the $1 million transfer in from the general fund for the dedicated sales tax for a total revenue increase of $5.2 million. And here's the increases in SUA operating fund expenditures. So we are realizing a purchase power increase of about $3.2 million and about $1.2 million in natural gas for the Stillwater Energy Center. So the natural gas increase is essentially the offset to the energy payment revenue on the previous slide. Because if you think about it, the more we run the plant and sell that energy, the more natural gas that we have to buy. And we have an increase of about $570,000 in electric payroll, $75,000 increase in other payroll, and then provided an inflationary adjustment to the SUA departments, just like in the general fund when they submitted their operating budget requests. And then we had a little bit of a decrease in some intra-fund transfers for a total increase of $5.2 million in expenditures. So when we net the revenues and the expenditures together, we see that our net revenue increase is zero. And so that doesn't really provide any additional funds to transfer to the general fund to meet any deficits there. So before I move on in the slides, I want to pause for a minute and then talk a little bit about the transfers between the SUA and the general fund and kind of how those work. So first of all, only surplus revenues of the electric utility and waste management are even eligible to transfer to the general fund. The waste management rate study that was completed in 2020 provided up to $1 million in annual transfers. And for the most part, the waste management has been able to meet that target. But the electric utility works a little bit differently. It doesn't have a cap on it, and so it's relied on much more heavily to meet those deficits on the general fund side. Additionally, after the fiscal year ends and the audit is concluded, any transfers that were not needed to balance the general fund must be returned to the SUA. And this is per the SUA transfer policy that the SUA trustees have adopted. The trustees do, however, have the ability to designate those excess transfer funds for other purposes rather than returning them to the SUA, and that has happened on several occasions. And usually that is to dedicate those funds for a particular capital purpose. So on this slide is a look at our transfers over the last several years. The top row of the table represents the transfer included in the adopted budget. That second row represents the amount determined during the year-end process to be excess transfers. And then that third row is the net transfer needed to balance the general fund as of the close of the year. So you can see that the net transfer consistently comes in less than what was budgeted in the beginning, and that is really to be expected. And that's due to things like unfilled positions, unused contingency funds. In some cases, actual expenditures may come in under what was budgeted. And then in some cases, it's just revenues come in greater than what was originally projected. So you'll also notice in the fiscal year 22 column, which is our current fiscal year, that there's $1.5 million noted in the transfer not needed. So this is one of the action items that I mentioned at the top of the presentation that would require council approval in order to adopt the budget that's before you today. So as I said, the budget continues to be tight, and despite that increase in revenue that we went through before. And so for that reason, the city manager's office asked the department directors to identify funds that that they did not anticipate needing during this last quarter of the fiscal year, or projects that they felt like they could defer. And so the directors did rise to that challenge, and they collectively identified that $1.5 million. And so a budget amendment will be brought to the council for consideration in April.
And if I may jump in here
Yes.
for just a minute, all of those directors would probably tell you those were funds that were needed, and understandably. But obviously, to balance next year's budget and for some of the items that we're going to discuss in the continuation of this meeting, we had to find extra funds put into the budget. So, sorry, but
That was very appropriate to interrupt me.
Just to be clear, we're talking about budgeted numbers for fiscal year 22.
The 1.5 is coming from budgeted numbers in 22, yes.
Because we're ahead of budget currently in fiscal year 22, right? We're ahead
Revenues.
of revenue and below expenses.
Yes,
When we get to the end of the year, assuming we didn't spend as much as we thought we were going to spend and we made more than we thought we were going to make, we'll have a positive net budget number, revenue number.
that is what I expect.
And this would offset some of this, correct?
That's correct.
So once everything comes out in the wash, we may be still transferring money back to the SUA that we didn't need from the budget at $17 million.
That is correct.
Okay. So we're putting this in place just in case that doesn't happen. Or, I mean,
Yes.
because it's not planning for that.
By taking formal action to unappropriate those dollars, that allows us to use those dollars in planning for the next year's budget. Because on paper, we can't obligate $1 twice.
That makes sense.
and those fund balances are very frustrating. When those end of the year fund balances are very frustrating to us, because they may have been necessary to be deployed elsewhere. But the point is, and Shelby said this, that fund balance would be probably necessary to buy some capital items
Sure.
and contribute that money to those capital items, not operating. So,
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, so the first bullet point on this slide is just that $1.5 million budget amendment we just talked about. That second bullet point is approval of a budget amendment totaling $1.4 million, which moves a wastewater project from the SUA operating fund to the wastewater fund. So this project was started before the wastewater fund was created, and now that fund has been established and has balance to support this project, it's more appropriate to fund the completion of this project from those dedicated wastewater rates. So then by doing that, taking that action, that really does free up that $1.4 million in the SUA operating fund to use for other purposes. And so I will point out once more that neither one of these action items, or both of these action items, are included and assumed in the budget that's presented tonight. But those budget amendments will be coming to you in April. So the final action item is a recommendation to reinstate the automatic utility rate escalator, which again was intended to just offset inflation. This escalator was suspended in January 2019, pending completion of the utility rate studies. Those studies were completed in the spring of 2020, and rate adjustments were recommended, including reinstitution of this escalator. And with the exception of waste management, no action was taken to adjust rates at that time or has been taken since then.
No action was taken. We adjusted electric rates.
We did not.
We didn't adopt any of the adopted rates? We didn't
No,
adopt
we had
just the
presentation. I
escalator.
believe John McClinney made presentation of the recommendations of the rate study, but there was not action
Did
taken.
we not take action because COVID and we didn't want to change rates during, I think
That-
that's what we did.
That's correct, and actually, that's been in front of you twice, and both times, we're,
Yep.
and it just doesn't look like there's gonna be a good time. I mean, frankly, we've got a war, we've got inflation, we've got crazy fuel prices, and they're probably gonna continue to go up, but, so do our expenses, and while I'm whining, two bid packages we've received lately. Engineer's estimate of $235 on one, and it came in at $600,000. And another one was $45,000 over, and I can't remember exactly what the original total was, but and we receive almost daily notices from vendors about surcharges for fuel. So, and we're not the only ones in that boat. We're hearing that from everybody else. So, again, there's just not a good time to raise rates.
I do think, while nobody wants their electric bills to go up, I do think it's important to point out, in the last year to year and a half, we've had 2 rent and utility assistance programs to help people. We're about to start a 3rd. And I would also point out, when we had the ice storm, that the city is footing the bill for half of that and only passing along half the cost to our customers versus 100%. And so, again, while no one wants to see their electric bill go up, I think it's also important to remember what the city has done to help our utility customers through some very hard times.
And those efforts you're talking about total about $4 million.
Mm-hmm.
So.
All right. Okay, so the rate escalator in its prior form provided for an annual increase to the electric, water, and wastewater rates equal to the lesser of 3% or the change in consumer price index for the South Urban region. The historical cap of 3% has been sufficient to cover inflation. However, with the inflation rates that we're seeing currently, that 3% just not sure cuts it. So staff is supportive of looking at a greater inflationary change to right-size our rates. And then this would allow us to cover those higher material costs that we're already seeing and have been seeing for some time, as well as adjust employee compensation to keep our positions competitive in the job market today. So I want to go ahead.
One of the reasons to ask the reason to ask department directors to scrub their budget was so that we would have sufficient funds to not fix, but try to at least catch up some on our pay plan. And you'll hear more about that later.
But I do want to point out that this action item has not been included in the budget that you've seen today. And also, the employee compensation actions that Christy Driscoll is going to talk about here in a few minutes have also not been included in the budget that you've seen today.
Do you have a sense of what those additional revenues would be on the electric side if we were to adopt the new
Yes.
rates?
So 3% is about $1 million. 5.1% is about $1.5 million. I think we went through and did a calculation on the full 15.7. That was I don't think I brought it with me, unfortunately. I think it was upwards of $5 million.
Sure.
Yeah,
I don't think a 15% increase is in the cards, but
that was kind of
is
a stretch.
that based off
but
current rates or is that based off the proposed rates from the rate study that we?
That's based off current rates.
Okay. Because if I recall, on smaller bills, the proposed rates were actually going to save some people money.
Yeah, the proposed rates for electric were intended to be a revenue neutral change. It was shifting some things between the fixed cost and the variable cost components.
Yeah. Okay. Do you know, not to skip ahead to Christie's presentation, but what the additional costs of those estimates will be?
I think that's a little bit more of a complicated answer, so I don't think I'm going to attempt to answer that unless you want to chime in on that.
We can wait.
I don't want to steal Christie's thunder
we'll give
because
her the
she's
hard
going to go
questions
through
there.
that.
Yeah, frankly, what we would do is use the funds available, those funds available to start on the pay plan.
Yep.
And again, we'll fix it, but it'll help.
And that's really it. So if you have other questions, I would be happy to try to answer them.
Counselors, what questions do you have about the budget? I'm going to ask a really obvious one, but going back to your original, the first couple of slides where the fiscal year proposed revenue overall, transfers excluded, is 135.9, and the overall expenditure budget is 122.1. Where's that $14 million going?
So that's somewhat of a complicated answer because these slides look at the organization in totality. So many of those funds are dedicated or restricted. And so that's why I really focused my part of the presentation on those unrestricted and undesignated funds, because those are the funds that kind of drive operations and fund our operations. So specifically, I can look specifically at general fund. So here there's an increase of, what is that? Just under 10 million.
Mm-hmm.
The slide that I showed you showed an increase of about 9 million, just under 9 million. So the difference there is, let me skip ahead, because I said I was going to net some numbers. So on this third line down, the net MRG to American Airlines, that gross expenditure amount is actually $2 million, but OSU is cost sharing that with us.
Mm-hmm.
So that $1 million is actually a revenue to us. So on the first slide, it's shown as a revenue, but here it's netted with the expenditure.
Okay.
That didn't answer your question.
It does. I get that there's math going on in the background.
Yeah.
But, just, revenue by fund type, general fund, fiscal year proposed budget, 44.2 million. Expenditure by fund type, general fund, proposed 37.7 expenditures. There's $7 million
And
there.
it does exclude transfers, so that further complicates it, because that $6 million transfer of sales tax is not reflected in this expenditure slide
Okay.
in front of us.
So I guess I'm not sure this is a very helpful.
The transfers greatly complicate things.
Yeah. To me, having sat here and done these things for a few years now, the general fund budget, the SUA budget, and then the the transfers between them make sense. When we put them together, it's very confusing.
It gets very confusing.
And I think for the public generally, if you're watching this on TV or you're looking at this later, I think you would be sitting here going, well, wait a second, it looks like you're making $14 million next year just based on these numbers. And so as we move forward in this process, I think we need to find a way to express this to the public in a way that doesn't make them question why we've got $14 million in the bank.
I think trying to exclude the transfers was an attempt to simplify things, but I think because of the latter part of the presentation, it probably complicated things.
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult when you're switching back and forth between the two to try to figure out, well, wait, where's that money going? Yeah. And this is lumped together, and then we split it out, and then it's complicated.
It's complicated. There's a lot of moving parts to a city budget.
There are, and I think it does make more sense as shown as the general fund, the SUA fund, and then of course there's 15 other ones that are out there that we have budgets for.
Yeah.
But to make it a little bit more clear that we are taking in a certain amount of money to spend on general fund expenses, and we're spending all that money. We're spending more than that amount of money on general fund, and then we're taking in a certain amount of money on SUA. We're spending less than what we're taking in, and we're moving some of it over to cover the operating fund. Again, just as we go forward, making that a little bit clearer for the public.
Absolutely, we will work on that.
And it's also worth noting that these transfers are necessarily complicated because they're required by statute.
Correct.
Everything's required to go through the general fund, pretty much.
All general taxes are, and so the sales tax must come into the general fund by statute before it goes anywhere else. So yes.
No.
So it looks like a shell game, but it's a statutorily required shell
Right.
game.
Like our purchasing policies. So we're also budgeting $5 million, another $4 million probably in transportation that hasn't even begun to be collected yet, and we can't spend it until we have it in the bank.
Sure.
So there's a portion of that probably will not get spent in that fiscal year.
Because it gets saved for,
Right.
I think it's always a gentle reminder to me that our city is operating our police and our fire. I mean, we are the last state that depends on sales tax and use tax to help fund our operating costs. And so we have to do transfers because we don't make enough coming in order to help pay for those expenses. And so that's another gentle reminder to me to think, wow, this is why we have to do those things.
And it's why we ask the people about bond issues to do
Right.
things like large capital projects.
Yeah. So just a gentle reminder about that.
There is, at least in our packet, this general fund budget sheet,
Yes.
which is, I guess, not on the presentation.
It's not in the presentation, but it is, I think, a very helpful, just one-pager.
And it does just sort of show the general fund, and it shows that the general fund's budget is a net loss of $17.2 million, which is what we have to then transfer over from SUA.
Yep.
And I think these one-pagers for each fund, or at least for the SUA as well,
Okay.
are helpful because it does, very clearly sort of break it down and show you that we expect $27 million in general revenue fund sources, general fund revenue sources, and then we're going to spend $12.1 million on police, and we're going to spend $8.2 on fire, and it's just a much clearer breakdown of where that money's going. And then for people who complain about some of the things that aren't necessarily seen as core civic expenses, like the Sister Cities Fund, which is literally $1,700 compared to a budget of $27 million. I think it helps clarify that these are not crazy things that we spend money on the back page that are elective. So anyway, I like these. These are great.
Okay. I do just want to point out also that on the rate escalator that you can take action on that this evening if you so choose to. It is on the agenda to do so.
Yeah, the
action would be limited to a motion that you want them to bring back a resolution to reinstate
'Cause
the
it
rate
doesn't-
escalator.
okay.
It wouldn't actually be.
So it wouldn't be the
Yeah,
percentage or the actual amount, it would just be that to go ahead and reinstate
That's
it.
right.
Okay.
To bring back a resolution to reinstate it.
Yes.
Which
and
we don't
just-
even
it would
really
be
need a
an
motion.
item on a future agenda so that you could look at some options and then we would reinstate
Do we
it.
even need a motion or an action to ask staff to bring the electric rate issue back to an SUA meeting so that we can?
Not necessarily, they just opened it up to that.
Well, I think we do need to bring the electric rate issue back to an SUA meeting so we can take action on the rate study, which we, as you mentioned, we suspended the escalator based on the fact that the rate study was ongoing. It looked like maybe we weren't gonna, that those rates might change a little bit, and so we might not need that, at least for that first year. And then COVID happened and all of that sort of got blown up. So I think we certainly do need electric rates back on an SUA agenda as soon as possible, because we need to be able to plan for that with this budget.
Are you making the motion?
I would make that motion that we'd like to see that. I don't know that we need it, but sure.
Second.
So we have a motion and a second to ask staff to bring electric rates back to an SUA agenda at a future meeting. Please vote. With a vote of 4-0, that motion passes. Thank you.
All right.
So we'll move now to item B, which is presentation of proposed pay plan adjustments by Christy Driscoll.
Good.
And no action will be taken on this item
Correct.
by the agenda.
Good evening. As Christy and Mr. McNichol already mentioned, the compensation package I'm going to talk to you about this evening is contingent upon putting that escalator back into play at a future council session. During last month's study session, we discussed the importance that compensation, retirement, and health benefits play in the recruitment and retention of valuable employees. At this time, we return to you with more information on our path forward to better align these three key pieces of overall compensation with the current competitive job market. This also moves us in the right direction for retention and recognition of current employees. Moving forward on salary, staff will be conducting a multi-pronged review and approach to compensation adjustment for July 1. This review will include discussions with each department director centering on appropriateness of current pay structures in their areas and where changes are needed most. Staff will review each position and position type for recent adjustments, internal and external equity, progression appropriateness, and industry relevance. Priority positions, those identified who need more immediate adjustment based on the factors previously mentioned, will be adjusted first. A second phase of the review will be based on pay adjustments by salary tier as a way to address economic movement since the last system-wide pay adjustment. A multi-phase approach allows staff to best address individual position concerns and the pay structure as a whole while still being responsive to the cost of living increases across the nation. The tiered approach provides a more appropriate adjustments by salary level where a larger percentage of increase may be necessary due to a lower starting salary. This adaptation of a cost of living adjustment allows the city to better place financial resources where they are most appropriate and are most needed. To explain that in a little bit more detail, several positions across the city have had compensation reviews and adjustments over the past 2 years. These reviews have placed them appropriately at market at that time. If they were to receive a standard across-the-board adjustment, this would move them out of market, while for other positions, this movement may still not catch them up. Also, for example, a 4% across the board hits very differently for an employee already earning $100,000 versus an employee at $32,000. This review and recommendation will take place for a July 1 effective date. Funds for this process have been tentatively set aside pending full review and approval of FY23 budget and approval of the rate escalator, as previously discussed tonight. Staff would then continue to review and recommend changes as needed to compensation strategy, staffing, and total employee compensation through fiscal year 23. The July 1 adjustments are only our first step in our full total compensation review. This review ensures that the city's financial resources are being deployed in an appropriate manner that is fiscally responsible and in line with employees, both current and prospective, expectations of an employer of choice. This discussion pertains only to general employees' compensation. We are just beginning negotiations with our unions regarding their compensation and potential changes. Now, for health insurance, we recently met with our broker regarding renewal for several of our health benefits. During this meeting, we received some very good and very unexpected news. The city is able to make adjustments behind the scenes in plan administration that results in no increase to current employee premium sharing. This allows us to continue to offer a very valued benefit to our employee with no cost increase to them at July 1 renewal. We're also happy to report that our life insurance and dental insurance pieces are also on track to renew with no premium increase. Staff will be back at a future council meeting to request authorization for the city manager to sign benefit contracts on behalf of the city. It is expected for that to occur in approximately 1 month when final contracts are released. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Christy. Councilors?
You mentioned the last system-wide pay adjustment. I know you said some departments have had reviews and have had some pay adjustments. When was the last system-wide pay adjustment?
System-wide was 2018.
2018. Thank you.
Any other questions?
Looking forward to seeing the results.
I am too. I'm going to turn it over to, I'm sorry, Councilor
I
Huckins.
think just one comment, as you were talking about the different levels and what a 3% increase is for one salary versus what it is for someone making a much lower salary, and looking at different tiers, a simpler way may be just to say you're going to get, everyone's going to get at least X dollars versus, or 3%, $1,000 or 3%, whichever is greater.
Mm-hmm.
So that's also an option of how to look at it.
Yes, and I appreciate that comment. I'm now going to turn it over to Melissa Reams, and she's going to discuss the retirement options with you. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, we'll move to item 2C, discussion and possible action on proposed adjustments to the City of Stillwater's OKMRF plan.
Good evening, councilors and mayor. Melissa Reams, Deputy City Manager. And if you'll recall, back in February 28th, we talked about amending our current retirement plan to encourage attraction of talent and encourage also the retention of that talent. Since then, we've looked at many different methodologies. There's probably a bazillion of them that we could pick and choose. So we tried to focus in on what step could we take in the next fiscal year, knowing that things are tight and that as staff and city manager and deputy city manager, our focus is on our people and getting the pay plan adjusted. But what could we do to the retirement plan that still would help us recruit talent and retain it? And one of the things that we did discuss in February was adjusting the vesting schedule. Currently, we're on the 10-year vesting schedule, and you see that listed down here. You have to be here, have completed 5 years of service before you're even vested 50%. And then each year thereafter, until you have completed 10 years, you get 10% additional of the employer contribution in the plan. In my discussions with the staff at OMRF, which they've been doing this for 56 years, not these same people, but the plan's been in motion for 56 years. Their recommendations and what they've seen are as follows. In the private sector, they believe that the average vesting schedule in the private sector is about 3 years. Now, that could be a 3-year cliff vesting schedule. You complete 3 years and then you're 100% vested in your plan. Or we could look at it as a third each year. 4 years, you could have, again, a cliff vesting schedule at the completion of the 4th year, or 25, 25, 25, 25. And 5 years, again, cliff vesting, or 20% each year. Then when we get into 6 and 7, that first couple of years, depending on which category we're in, you might not vest at all, but then you're going to vest 20% over the rest of the life, or the remaining of the years. we've had a lot of discussions. Just staff has had discussions because we today received the results or the preliminary results of the employee survey. And one of the areas of improvement that was identified is helping the employee feel like the organization cares. And the more that Mr. McNichol and I have reflected on that, we feel like maybe awarding some employer vesting each year that might enhance that feeling that the employer cares, the employer is concerned for the employee's future, which we are. But this is a more tangible, viable way for that employee to see that care. For me, looking at this and having served on the Board of Trustees for OMRF for the last 4 years, the sweet spot for me is somewhere between 5 and 7. You know, it just, that feels like a good first step, and we can adjust this periodically if we feel the need to adjust. But my thought was we would take a step this direction and see what kind of change, how it moves the needle, if it moves the needle. Does it help us attract? Does it help us retain? Does it improve employee satisfaction? And please remember that at the last meeting that we discussed the vesting schedule, we also talked about the employer's need for return on our investment in our employees. And today I approved a couple of requisitions that totaled pretty close to $1,000 between 2 employees, and this was simply for testing to get them their water license and get them up to speed as far as that is concerned. That's just one example. If you're an apprentice electrician and or a journeyman electrician, we're going to invest more money in you. We invest in our employees by buying their clothing. If you're required to be in FR, we're going to buy your clothing. We're going to buy your safety boots and your safety glasses. So we do invest in our employee safety, but as the employer, we need to be able to feel like before they leave and take their show on the road, as I like to say, that we have gotten some return on that benefit. And I was visiting with Mr. McNichol this afternoon. Even me coming in at a higher level, having been on the flip side of all of this revenue going back and forth, it still's taken me, I would say, 2 to 3 cycles just to get to know the books of business that are here in the city and get to feel comfortable with the routine and the rhythm of what goes on here in the city. So this evening, you can take action on this. You can choose not to take action. We can bring it back to you at a different point in time. But that would be our recommendation. And then I think over the next year, this costs us no money. And over the next year, I want to work with OMRF and their attorneys and both Mrs. Driscoll and Mrs. Cluck to figure out what, again, does that additional compensation look like. Let's just say we went with a 7-year vesting schedule. Then in year 8, 9, and 10, much as Councilor Hawkins pointed out to us at that February 28th meeting, we could, to retain people, we could increase our employer match. Maybe you increase it in year 8 to 8%, 10% in year 9, and 12% in year 10. And maybe that helps that retention along the way. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
So remind me, if you would, what happens to the money that is left behind when an employee leaves and hasn't fully vested?
That's a really good question. They're called forfeitures because you have not earned the employer's contribution. And when you leave before that earning date, it just reverts back to the employer and it comes back to us as a credit against our bill that we pay to OMRF every month for the contributions we've collected on the payrolls during that month.
So on average, how much does that amount to in a given year? ballpark?
I will say it's been more in recent
Because we've had people leave.
than historically. If I had to ballpark it, I would say it's probably 200,000, 250,000.
Yeah.
It's been significant the last years.
Can you repeat that in the microphone?
Yes. So Mrs. Cluck was saying in the last couple of years it's been significant because we've seen a larger number of employees depart that were not fully vested in the plan. And she estimated it about $200,000 a year. And that, Christy, I think those forfeitures show up in other revenues? Yeah. So in your little pie chart that she was showing you, other revenues.
So there really is a cost associated with vesting faster.
Is it a
because-
cost? I mean,
well,
we've already expended it.
but it comes back to us if they don't take it with them.
It does, but it feels counterintuitive to set this up such that we are. It just feels counterintuitive that we're gonna wish that they fail and we get the money back.
Well, I agree with that, but there's still real money that comes back to us if they're not fully vested.
True. You could look at it that way. Yeah.
What is that $200,000 compared to what is our overall expenditure to OMRF?
Yeah. I
I
don't.
mean, is that?
Yeah.
I mean, yeah. So we're talking about a fairly small percentage of it comes back as okay.
Mm-hmm.
So this is very much in line with what I'm sort of thinking about. Okay, if we're investing in these employees and we're putting this money into them, and we're trying to make sure we get our investment back at some level, is that $200,000 the way we, how much money we get back from their non-vested retirement fund, how we calculate that, or is their length of service and how much they're able to do for the organization? How we measure whether we got our investment out of these employees.
And I guess my heart lies with the second option there. I want them here, working, contributing, and growing. Again, it just feels very counterintuitive to feel like they're going to fail and they're not going to stay.
I think that's the reasonable way to look at it, right? That this $200,000 is a drop in the bucket in terms of, it doesn't really pay us back for the amount that we invested in an employee if they leave in year 3 and they haven't generated the benefit to the organization from all that training and experience that we're now going to have to go invest in someone else.
Right.
And so to me, the question when it comes to this, where do we want our vesting schedule? How do we look at what our vesting schedule does for us is how do we keep from losing people in year 3 versus how much do we get back when they do leave in year 3? I think we asked this last time we had this conversation, but what's our average tenure at the city?
11 and a half years, Mrs. Driscoll.
And do you feel like that would go up or down if we moved our vesting schedule shorter, or do you think it would have any effect at all?
Well, that's what we're going to find out if we move it around. I would like to think that we would see that number go up because the quicker that they can vest, and then if we can bring this second piece along, this carrot along to stay even longer, then I hope we would have the ultimate opportunity to mentor and create that loyalty to this organization. And that was some of the things that we looked at today when we were looking at the employee survey. There was a large number, wasn't there, Mr. McNichol, that said they wouldn't work anywhere else, that this is where they want to be. So we want to mentor, we want to create that culture of being the gold standard. This is where people should want to work, is here at the city.
Well, and that's where I was headed with my line of questioning earlier.
Okay.
That really, the $200,000 is a drop in the bucket in this whole thing, right? And so I would like to see a faster vesting schedule that maybe you reward their first year of completion with, you've just vested the first 20%. So look at it in a 5-year schedule versus the 7-year that was sort of alluded to in the packet. I'd like to see us vest a little quicker and reward their first year of success with a little bit of vesting.
Okay. And again, I'm set, for me, it's somewhere between 5 and 7. It could be 5. And I've been with an organization where it was 5. it didn't stop the teachers from looking around, and they were here and gone, and, you know. But I would say our employee pool is different than that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it matters if we're looking at this from a standpoint of we're getting plenty of people in, we're just not keeping them long enough, versus we're not getting people in, right? And right now it seems like our bigger problem is not getting people in, right? Versus people are here 5 or 6 years and then they're leaving. Mm-hmm. What we're trying to be more enticing towards is folks who are looking for a new job. And that earlier vesting schedule is going to be a bigger deal to people who are looking. And then we have that chance to show them how great of an organization this is to work for, mm-hmm. and to keep them around for a while. But if they're looking and saying it's going to be 2 years before I get anything, it could be currently it's 5 years before I get anything, mm-hmm. then I think that hurts our ability to recruit more than it hurts our ability to retain. Mm-hmm. And I would agree with Kevin that having that sort of earlier vesting where there's something, that's there early mm-hmm. on would make us more attractive to folks who are looking at switching. Because as we talked about last time, I just don't think the newer generations, the workers who are out there looking for their first or second jobs, the idea of staying somewhere 5 years, one in and of itself is probably hard to imagine. Mm-hmm. The idea of not fully vesting for 10, I mean, that's a lifetime away. And so I think to be able to retain, we need to look at that shorter 5-year schedule where we can give them something early on and try to get those folks to come find out what a great place the city of Stillwater is to work.
Well, or to at least not feel like if they are coming here, that they're giving up something mm-hmm. that they had in the private sector.
Is it on the 7-year schedule that you had showed us that they started getting a portion after year 3 and then 20% each year?
Well, that was what we were talking about back in February, was an increase in the employer match.
Okay. Oh.
Yeah.
No, I think this was the vesting schedule is what I was thinking of. I mean, even if we went, and I think I agree, 5 years seems, I like the 5-year option,
okay.
But even if we went with 7 years, can it be tweaked to where there's a certain percentage that they're vested every year instead of?
Definitely. We just need to review that with OMRF's plan attorney from McAfee Taft, but I haven't thrown anything at them over the last couple of months that they haven't been able to downshift and give me an answer. So I think we could tailor this to meet our needs, definitely.
So does this vesting schedule work on service anniversaries, on fiscal years?
It works
How is
on
this
service
counted?
anniversaries.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And if we were to change it, would everyone, current employees would get the new vesting schedule?
Correct.
So if you've already been here 3 years, would you get a 60% vest, or would it kick in now you're your first year from here?
It would be, we would make you whole whenever this kicks in. We were looking at this being activated July 1, just because that's a good.
Sure.
Although with the we should just do it with July 1. So we'll use me for example. My anniversary date is October the 5th, and I have 6 years and however many months now here at the city. So if you went with a 5-year vesting schedule, I would now be fully vested.
On your next anniversary date?
No, immediately,
July 1,
because
okay.
I've been here longer than the 5 years.
Okay.
But if we went with a 7-year schedule, you would be partially vested and then fully vested on your next.
On my anniversary date, that's correct. And a couple of things that the executive director wanted me to remind everybody: with this plan, once you reach age 65, you're fully vested. Even if you've only been here a year, you're fully vested.
Oh.
So we have a lady, the one example that I'm aware of, we have a lady over in police records, and I think she was maybe 63 when we hired her, so she's fully vested now. And then you do vest upon disability and death.
Okay, so I want to be sure I understand something you said. At one point you said we'll make it effective July 1, but then you said you would be immediately effective upon our vote, or as of July 1?
Well, I was thinking about the conversation we'd had back in February where we were increasing the matches, and that was going to be effective July 1. With this vesting schedule, it probably could become effective immediately.
Okay. I just want to make sure that we're all understanding the same
Well,
thing.
and again, that is one of the questions I did not ask today, so I need to follow up with that. But that makes sense to me. When you change the contributions, you'd want to wait till the beginning of your fiscal year, but this really just changes the numbers out at OMRF and at the Voya platform where the participant can go out and see what their vesting is. So we'd have to work with Voya to get that up and going as well.
This might be a question for Christy, but Christy Driscoll. So say we did that, and if you'd like to step back up, I'd appreciate it. I mean, I guess looking at this from a worst case scenario sort of standpoint, if we were to make this vote and all of a sudden, I don't know, a few dozen people at the city went from not having vested at all yet to being either fully or close to fully vested, do you feel like that could be detrimental to the retention that we have of those folks? Do you feel like somebody might go, oh, now I'm fully vested, I can take off and take all that retirement money with me, where I was keeping, I mean, I guess my question is, how many people are still here after being here for 5 years and all they're doing is sitting around waiting for their retirement to vest? I mean, I don't think it's very many. I don't think most people make decisions like that, but maybe.
I would say our most frequent turnover that we're seeing right now is that less than 2-year employee. So I think once we get them past that 2-year to 3-year mark, they're more vested in us as an organization and their career growth. So they've kind of set up roots themselves here. Where I see us mainly being attractive in that lower vesting schedule, as you guys mentioned, is when that recruitment piece. Like you mentioned, Mayor, we talked about last time, 2 years are no longer considered a job hopper. That's considered somebody who's progressively moving through their career. And for them to join us right now and see, I won't receive any of my employer's contribution unless I'm there 5 years, it could potentially take us off the table as a recruitment. Because if their plan is to join somewhere for 3 to 4 years, we're not a player in that field. And so if we can get somebody in here 3 to 4 years, I feel much better about them staying here with career opportunity. But we have to be on the market or on their radar to even get them in the door.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Further questions, counselors? Do we want to take an action on this item, or do we want to get some more information from Melissa about exactly how it would work with application before we do that?
Yeah, I think we ought to make sure that it goes smoothly when we make a decision.
So, yeah. So
Let's get more information.
come back with when does it kick in? How does that work? Make sure we understand if we would go to a 5-year, 20% a year vesting schedule, mechanically, what's that look like?
Because you have to work with Voya, they've got to get it in their process and their systems as well. When they get the request for transfers to another 401k or to a traditional IRA.
I assume you know what you're talking about.
I do.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
Anything else on the retirement fund?
That's it for me.
That is all we have on the agenda for the evening. Counselors, any further questions for staff? Is there a motion to adjourn?
Move we adjourn.
Second.
We have a motion and a second to adjourn the city council meeting. Please vote. With a vote of 4-0, Stillwater City Council is now adjourned. Thank you.